Hi there, this is Barbara Schreiner and I'm going to take you through the second module in terms of integrated water, energy, food, otherwise known as Nexus planning. So the first module looked at some of the more generic aspects of integrated water, energy, food planning, and in this we're going to look at some of the different approaches that have been adopted in different Nexus planning frameworks. So I think it's important to recognize that there are different planning frameworks and that different ways of conceptualizing the water, energy, food nexus give a different lens and a different way of looking at things. And so as we go through some of these frameworks, we'll be addressing how they take a slightly different slant on the water, energy, food nexus. This first image sets out what is a generic framework for the water, energy, food nexus. In the center, you have the water, energy, and food circles. On the left, you have key issues around social issues, environmental issues, and economic issues. And all of those run through the framework to hopefully, if one gets the planning process right, arrive at sustainable solutions for the delivery of social, economic, and environmental goods and services to people through an integrated approach to looking at water, energy, and food. That is a very generic framework. If one starts looking more specifically at some of the frameworks, one of the initial frameworks is what is called integrated water resource management. And those who've been working in the water sector will know the integrated water resource management paradigm fairly well. It's a globally accepted paradigm for managing water resources. In fact, IWRM is in essence a nexus planning approach. It requires a look at the different sectors and how they all engage. What is important, however, is that IWRM takes water as the central point. So it looks at energy and food through the lens of water, and it centralizes water. Other frameworks put a different emphasis, and some frameworks try to address all three of them simultaneously. In fact, when looking at the nexus planning approach, it's often useful to identify which is the key constraint of the three elements and focus on that as the central core. And in some cases, water is the key constraint. In other cases, it may be land and food, or it may be energy that is the key constraint that defines the problem one is trying to deal with. So the World Economic Forum, and one should not confuse the initials WEF, meaning World Economic Forum, with the initials WEF, meaning Water, Energy, Food Nexus. The World Economic Forum has its own description of the water, energy, food nexus. If one looks at their approach to it, it is very much around the issue of addressing water, energy, and food security, but very much with a business lens and with a global macroeconomic lens on issues. And it does not address in a great level of detail who actually benefits and what the distributional aspects of the water, energy, food nexus are. And we'll come to some approaches later that perhaps stress that issue of the distributional benefits and disbenefits in a better way. The International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, has also developed a nexus framework, very much based on their work in Nepal and in the Himalayas. And the essence of their work is that the ecosystems that underpin both energy, water, and food are critical to understanding the nexus. And that without understanding the underpinnings of the ecosystems and what those deliver and how those are managed, you cannot actually have a sustainable approach to the use of energy, water, and food. So that is very much the underpinning of that approach is what are the ecosystems and how does one deal with ecosystems in a sustainable manner. An increasingly common part of the discussion around the Nexus framework is around the concept of resource scarcity. That in fact, the need for the Nexus approach is driven by the fact that we have increasing resource scarcity and increasing demands on limited resources. What is interesting about the resource scarcity framework as it has been developed is that it does ask very clearly, scarcity for whom? Scarcity of what? In other words, who is it who is experiencing the scarcity of a particular resource? And that is because scarcity is not purely a physical dimension, but is a social construct. And very often, it is in fact the poor and particularly the rural poor, but even the urban poor as well, who experience the worst scarcity. So while there may be physical scarcity of water in a country, the wealthy are able to get enough water to meet their needs, and it is the poor who experience the real scarcity. And so scarcity has a social and economic dimension to it. And the resource scarcity approach to nexus planning says when you're looking at water, energy and food in an integrated way, you also very clearly need to look at who has access, who does not have access, how are the decisions that you're going to make impact on who has access, who does not have access, who is making those decisions on behalf of whom. And part of that is also the question of how does the issue of scarcity affect women and men differently, because very often there are gender differences in how scarcity of resources is experienced at various different levels. So a further development of the nexus planning approach is the climate, land, environment and water system that has been developed, which essentially brings together separate models in terms of land, environment and water, and brings those three models together in a way to say what are the points of intersection between these three models, the food and land, energy and water models. Where do we need data from one model to intersect with data from another model in order to give an integrated output from the modeling around land, energy and water, but also critically bringing in the question of climate. And that is what is known as the CLEWS framework, or CLEWS framework. One of the benefits of the CLEWS framework is that it enables one to examine and unpack possible trade-offs between the three different models and the water, energy and food interactions, and to understand what those trade-offs are so that one can look at them closely and decide on the particular trade-offs that are acceptable or not acceptable. Then there is something called the nexus-based adaptation framework. And the nexus-based adaptation framework examines the water, energy, food nexus, but examines in the same breath the vulnerability and poverty implications as well, looking at them in an integrated way, in a sense much in the same way that the resource scarcity framework does, and then trying to examine what is necessary in order to actually bring in adaptation and to deal with the issues of poverty and inequality within that framework as a whole. What is important to realize is that the integrated water, energy, food planning, or the nexus planning approach, can take place at a number of scales. So it could be at the transboundary or regional scale that one is looking at the WEF nexus. It could be at a national scale that one is looking at the WEF nexus. It could be at a subnational scale, perhaps a catchment or subcatchment scale, or it can in fact be something that one is looking at the local level. And it is probably, in fact, at the local level that there is most integration that, in fact, does take place, because at the local level, communities understand on a daily basis the integration between water, energy, and food, because it is a lived experience that they have on a daily basis. So when one is looking at the local level, it is very important to ensure that localized planning is, in fact, participatory and involves the community in the planning that is taking place. And so there is an approach called community-based participatory planning. And there are a number of steps that one can look at in terms of community-based participatory planning. Essentially, if one is looking at the nexus planning in rural areas, it is critical to put the local community or the small farmer or the micro-enterprise person at the center of the planning, and recognize that they have integrated needs, so that water is necessary in order to grow crops or to provide water for livestock. It is necessary for household purposes, for washing and for food. The crops may well be necessary in order to provide biomass for cooking in the household. There are a number of integrated processes around that household. At the same time, there are significant demands on those same resources that take those resources away from the local community or the local household. And very often those outward pulls on the resources are in fact from urban areas that very often draw resources away from poor communities in the rural areas. And so the nexus planning at the community level needs to also understand how that fits in to a bigger framework that is in fact drawing resources away from the rural poor in particular. So in order to do community-based participatory planning. One of the first things one needs to do is to actually understand the local context. So spatially, what is the context? What is the boundary that communities see as their boundary of their area? Within that, what are the landscape features? What are the features around water availability, around land availability, around energy sources? What are the areas of degradation within that particular boundary? Where is there massive erosion? Where is there land that is no longer usable? What are the challenges around degradation? That gives one a spatial scale and a spatial understanding within which to address the nexus issues at the community level. It's then important, working with the community again, to understand what are the critical challenges and what possibly are some of the solutions. So what are the shocks that the community is vulnerable to? How are those shocks likely to be impacted on by climate change, amongst other things? And how do those challenges and vulnerabilities relate to land, energy and food and water? And what are the trade-offs that the community is facing between the use of all of those resources? So understanding what the actual reality on the ground is of the challenges that they're facing, but also what the opportunities are within that area. Having understood then what the landscape is and what the challenges and opportunities are within that landscape, it is then possible with the community to actually identify possible solutions, looking at all three, land and food, water and energy, as a coherent whole, to identify possible solutions and then to develop from those possible solutions a plan that then identifies who is going to be responsible for what, over what timeframes, what are the community able to do, what do they bring to the picture, what does government need to bring, private sector, NGOs, whoever the players are in that area, into a plan that can then actually be implemented and monitored according to a time frame that is set out in the plan. So in conclusion, we have run through at a very high level a number of different models for looking at nexus planning, for looking at integrated water, energy and food planning. And it is clear that they can be done at a number of levels. One can look from the regional level right through to the local level in terms of integrating one's approach to water, energy and food. What is also clear from what we've been through is that the model or approach that one takes influences the kind of results and the kind of options that will come out of it. Whether one chooses to take a lens that focuses specifically on the distributional impacts and who benefits and who doesn't benefit, or take a different lens in terms of what are the ecosystem requirements in terms of supporting that. So the different lens that one applies results in a different set of solutions that come out of the process. Ultimately, the intention behind taking a nexus approach or an integrated planning approach to water, energy and food is that it enables one to develop more sustainable solutions in the face of increasing competition for scarce resources, and it enables one to actually look very consciously at what are the trade-offs that are required and which trade-offs are acceptable, which trade-offs are not acceptable, and where there are win-win solutions that can actually be found in addressing the needs of people for water, energy and food. Thank you.